I am Hallie Casser-Jayne. Welcome to my listeners in the United States and around the world. Today on the Hallie Casser-Jayne Show, Benjamin Netanyahu defied the odds and won his fifth term as Israel's prime minister to become the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history, longer than even founding father David Ben-Gurion. And so I bring you an important conversation with one of Israel's most notable writers and commentators, journalist, and the author of the new book, Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel. Tune in to the Hallie Casser-Jayne Show at HallieCasser-Jayne.com. Compelling, compulsively readable, and arresting account of espionage at the genesis of the Israeli state are just some of the accolades given journalist and award-winning author, New York Times op-ed contributor, and former AP correspondent Matti Friedman for his new book, Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel, which examines the founding of Israel and the forging of Israeli identity through a little-known, real-life espionage story. Already the recipient of the Natan Book Award at the Jewish Book Council, Spies of No Country chronicles the exploits of a ragtag unit of Arabic-speaking Jewish spies assembled by the British during World War II, who would go undercover in the battle for Israeli statehood. A longtime resident of Jerusalem himself, Friedman sets out to reframe the story of Israel as a Middle Eastern one, freed from Europe-centric cliches, to tell a new story about the state's creation that reflects a more complicated story than the one Israel tells itself and the world. Let's talk with the author of Spies of No Country, Matti Friedman.
So nice to have you here. This is really a very special book. By the way, beautifully written. It introduces my listeners to what you write, to something I don't think most American Jews, or I don't think a lot of Jews think about when they think about Israel. You're talking about four young men who were caught up in the events surrounding the birth of Israel, who were not European Jewish men, but men from the Islamic world. Give us the background so we have a place to jumpstart our conversation.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. The book is set in 1948. So around the time of Israel's War of Independence. The British, who have controlled the land of Israel, the British Mandate territory of Palestine for about 30 years, are on their way out. The United Nations has decided to partition the territory into a Jewish state and an Arab state, and this sets the scene for a pretty intense war that lasts about a year and a half, which we Israelis call the War of Independence. At the time, 9 out of every 10 Jews in Palestine was from Europe, mostly Eastern Europe, places like Poland, Russia, Ukraine. Those are my own family roots. At the same time, though, there were about 1 million Jews who were native to the Islamic world. And these Jewish communities, which existed in almost every major city in the Islamic world, have been largely forgotten by the West. For example, many people don't know that in the 1940s, Baghdad was 1/3 Jewish. And there were large Jewish quarters in places like Casablanca, Tripoli in Libya, Tehran, Isfahan in Iran. That world was not really taken into account by the people who set up the State of Israel, but after 1948, that world is displaced amid violence and kind of state persecution, and the Jews from the Islamic world flee to the State of Israel. And my book features 4 main characters, Israel's first spies, who are Jews who come from the Arab world, who are native Arabic speakers, who can pass inside the Arab world with Arab identities. And if you understand their story, I think you understand something very important about the State of Israel that exists in 2019.
And that is?
Well, I think that people still tend to see the country as a very European place, so we tell a very simple European story about it, about Theodor Herzl and the early Zionist movement in Europe and the pogroms in Eastern Europe and the socialist idea, the kibbutz idea, and of course we know about the Holocaust. But actually half of the Jews in Israel come from the Islamic world. They have very little to do with Theodor Herzl and the Holocaust. They have a completely different story, and it's a story about being a minority in the world of Islam. And people miss much about Israel because they're focused on the European side of the country's identity and miss the Middle Eastern side of the country's identity. And my story about spies, which is in large part, a story about identity and double identity and maybe triple identity, is actually an attempt to get at the country's secret identity, which is that it's a Middle Eastern country that presents itself as European.
We're going to just explore all of those points that you made, because I think they're fascinating, and I think they have a lot to do with how Israel is perceived worldwide, sometimes mostly erroneously. But let's get back to your story. How did you get to this story? You met one of the men who was still alive at the time you were doing your talk about that.
That's right. I was working on my first book, which is called the Aleppo Codex, and it's about an ancient Bible manuscript that has a mysterious and kind of dirty story. And one of the characters in that book, it's a true story, one of the characters in the book is an old Mossad agent, an ex-Mossad agent born in Aleppo, Syria. Today he's almost 90. And he wanted to introduce me to a friend of his who's an even older ex-Mossad agent. And I wasn't sure exactly why I was going to meet this guy. His name was Isaac Shoshan, but I've learned, as I write in the book, that if someone offers to introduce you to an old spy, never say no. Always go. It will never be a waste of time, even if you don't know where you're going. So I met Isaac Shoshan on the 7th floor of kind of a very Soviet-esque block of apartments in a suburb of Tel Aviv, tiny apartment, a tiny guy. And he was almost 90 at the time. Today's 94. And he told me a story about the creation of the state that I had never heard before. And it was a story in which the main characters weren't Jews from Europe. They were Jews from the Arab world. And that first meeting with him led to many other meetings with him and many hours of recorded conversation. And that, in turn, led me to other spies who'd been involved in this very early intelligence operation, all of whom had passed away, but some of whom had left long oral testimonies about the operations around 1948. And that, in turn, led me to the military archive here, where I requested declassification of the 1948 files, which were still secret 70 years later. And to my surprise and pleasure, they declassified a lot of them, and all of that became the raw material for this book, Spies of No Country.
It astonishes me that this story hadn't really been told. Isn't that amazing? I mean, it was a gold mine for you. I mean, oh my God, what a story, what a book. But I mean, it really is astonishing that it wasn't, mainstream folklore.
It's true. The more I learned about this, the more I was stunned that I didn't know it. And I knew almost nothing in this book before I wrote the book. It's not like these were stories I had heard and I wanted to explore them further. I had never heard of the Arab section, which is the unit at the center of the book. I'd never heard of any of the participants in the story. I'd never heard of any of their operations. It was all completely new to me, and that is quite amazing. And that's, I think, in part because people want familiar stories. They want stories about characters who are similar to them. So that's one reason I think that people have always put the spotlight more on Israel's European side and less on the Middle Eastern side. These spies are quite foreign to a Western audience. They're Jews from places like Aleppo, from places like Yemen, Damascus, Syria. It's a very distant world from the world of a Western observer, and I think that this story doesn't immediately make sense to people looking at this place through a Western lens. And that's one reason I think that they were kind of relegated to the margins, which is unfortunate for them because I think they deserved a lot more credit than they got, but great for me as someone who kind of stumbled onto this story in 2011, 2012, and found that it was completely untouched.
I do want to say this. I mean, they did some extraordinary things, and we don't want to spend a lot of time on that because I want everybody to read the book to find out just how intriguing their story can be and how dangerous and how fascinating. But this ragtag group, really, right? That's really what they were. I mean, they did some stuff.
They did some stuff. They did some stuff for sure. And I think if people are imagining modern-day Israeli intelligence, and if you're imagining the Mossad, which has this mystique about it, and kind of high-tech, very sophisticated people with large budgets doing incredible things, you have to lose all of that if you want to understand what the Arab section was. And these guys were untrained. Some of them were basically street kids who'd been picked up by recruiters for the Arab section in their late teens in some cases, in their early 20s. In other, there was no intelligence doctrine here. There was no state. There was no intelligence service in an official capacity. They didn't own a camera, for example. So when they needed a camera, they had to borrow one from a guy who they knew, a civilian. When they were initially inserted into the Arab world, where they ended up setting up Israel's first intelligence station, they didn't have a radio. They had no way to communicate with headquarters, because this section had nothing. They weren't paid salaries. They had no equipment. So the whole operation is incredibly ad hoc. It's a seat of the pants effort, and that demands a price of them. About half of the spies active in the Arab section, about a dozen guys who were active in the section at the beginning of the 48 war, are caught and executed, largely because they were poorly trained and they didn't quite know what they were doing. And the fact that they do manage, some of them manage to not only survive the war, but kind of pull off these feats of intelligence and sabotage and get back home safely, that fact is quite incredible given what they were working with.
What was their allegiance? Where was their allegiance? What was their anger? Why would somebody put themselves up to that? They were raised in the Islamic world as Jews. Maybe that had something to do with it. Where were they on the allegiance to this, idea of a Jewish state? I think that's important. Talk to me about that a little bit.
It is important, and it's a great question, because these are natives of the Arab world. They speak Arabic, their culture is Arab, and yet their allegiance is 100% to this idea of creating a Jewish state, which we call Zionism. They were completely on board. Not only were they willing to invest incredible efforts into it, they were willing to die for it. And this raises a good question, which you asked, which is why? I think if you look at the mid-20th century, you see that many Jewish people concluded that hopes of assimilation or acceptance in their host countries were doomed. So the Jews were not going to be able to become full-fledged Germans, obviously, or French citizens, or Poles, or Russians, or Syrians, or Iraqis, or Moroccans. That the only solution, in fact, was a radical solution. They had to get out of these majority cultures and form a state where they can be the majority and where they can protect themselves. So many Jews in Europe reach this conclusion. Certainly after the Holocaust, people understand that this really is the only solution for them. In the Middle East, it takes a bit longer, but by the 30s and certainly by the 40s, some people, particularly young people in the Jewish communities inside the Arab world, are thinking along these lines. They understand that there's no future for them among or amid a Muslim majority, and they're kind of enchanted by the Zionist idea. So small numbers of them start coming to Palestine to join the pioneers. And these 4 spies are among the first ones to come, the early arrivals, and they're recruited by the intelligence services, and they end up playing a role in the creation of the state in 1948. After the creation of the state, and in part because of the creation of the state, there's this wave of violence targeting Jews in the Islamic world, and their entire world collapses and moves to Israel. So their home communities in Aleppo and Damascus and Yemen and Baghdad and places like that are lost, and today there's nothing left, and most of the descendants of those people are now Israelis. So they, I think, understood this early. They understood that this was maybe the only solution in a world that poses pretty grave dangers to Jewish people living amid majority populations. And I think if you look at the Middle East over the past 20 years, you see that this part of the world poses dangers to ethnic and religious minorities, not just to Jews.
Yeah, what in Iraq, isn't there a place where there are only 6 Jews left or 3 Jews left? I mean, it's, what was so much a part of a country gone, annihilated. And I talked to you about that for this reason. The same reason I want to ask you about your background and how you were born in Toronto and now are an Israeli, I don't know if you're a dual citizen, but at least an Israeli citizen too. Like my people, left, forced out of Hungary, forced out of Russia. We land all over different parts of my citizens. My family is, in Israel, here, wherever. People forget that. And I want to talk about it. That's what this book is so darn important. In a world where, again, it appears that anti-Semitism is on the rise, and particularly in the United States, which is really bizarre, we are now the victimizers, if you will, not the victims. What's really changed? We have Israel always under assault yesterday, right? Talk to me about your journey and how you got to Israel and how that really is a part of the story that you're actually writing about.
Well, my family has a story that's fairly typical of European Jewish families. Most of my grandmother's family was killed in the Holocaust, and That's, I think, pretty standard for people
Right.
who come from this background, and they move from Europe and they come to North America, and that's kind of a story that many Jewish families have. I was lucky to grow up in a wonderful place. I grew up in Toronto. I grew up in the 1990s, which in retrospect was a great decade that we didn't appreciate enough at the time. And I openly identified as Jewish, and I never experienced anything that I would interpret as ethnic hatred of any kind. But I felt that I was kind of out of step with the majority, and I wanted to be in a place where my culture was the culture of the majority, where my holidays are everyone's holidays, for example. So I came to Israel just for a year after I finished high school. This was 1995, and I intended to be here for a year, and just loved it too much to leave because I just liked being, I guess, a member of the mainstream. And here you can express your Jewish identity not necessarily by going to synagogue or doing anything religious. You can just order a pizza in Hebrew, and you can celebrate the Jewish holidays, which are the days that everyone gets off work and school. So it's a great kind of solution in that way. But in the years since I moved here, I think that these problems that Jews have faced have made a reappearance in a way that I would never have expected in the 1990s. I thought that was a problem that had been solved. So I wasn't running away from anything when I came here, and I really did think that this this acute problem that Jews have faced in their host societies over many, many centuries, I thought that was over after the mid-20th century. I thought that things had been taken so far in the 40s that people had kind of understood what the dangers were and that we wouldn't see this anymore. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is that it's not true. And just to give you an example, the French Jewish community has been eroded by growing hostility in France in the 21st century. And my neighborhood in Jerusalem has filled up with French people who have moved here over the past couple of years, in part because they no longer feel safe in France. And you'll hear similar stories from people who live in the UK, and I'm increasingly hearing stories from Americans who are quite surprised to find themselves even grappling with these questions in 2019. So I think one conclusion you're forced to reach is that deep civilizational problems like anti-Semitism don't go away. Mm-hmm. They change form, they might fade, but then they come back. And I think that the state of Israel, I think we're lucky to have it. I think that the people who set it up, people who had this idea at the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, the people who said, this is the only solution, and we have to do this, even though we're going to pay a price for it, and even though other people are going to pay a price for it, and pursued this goal with a very with incredible focus and a ruthlessness in many ways. And I would include my 4 spies in their number. I think we owe, or I owe, a real debt to those people, and I think that their genius, their incredibly acute, and their dark and pessimistic, but very acute understanding of human nature and the Jews' place in the world, that understanding has been borne out by events in the 21st century in a way that I think very few of us could have predicted.
Yeah.
You are listening to the Casser-Jayne Show. My guest today is journalist Matti Friedman, the author of Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel. The Casser-Jayne Show posts new podcasts Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern at HalleyCasserJayne.com and is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Be sure to find me on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, on all your favorite apps. You can find the Casser-Jayne Show on your Alexa device, too. Just say, the Casser-Jayne Show. Oh, and come play with me on Twitter at the CJ Show. We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us.
And I want to ask you this in terms of living in Israel. You don't know when the next bomb is going to be lobbed. You don't know when the next knife is going to be drawn or the next rock thrown. Living under those conditions, what's that like? Is it a day-to-day? It's like I lived in LA for a while, and I used to think about earthquakes all the time. It was always in the back of my mind somewhere. Was the big one coming? What's it like living in Israel? I don't think that question is asked enough of Israelis. I'm asking on a day-to-day basis.
Well, Israelis are experts at denial, and people have really perfected the art of dealing with this stuff and moving on. I mean, the country's cultural and economic center, Tel Aviv, came under rocket fire a week ago, and people literally looked up from their restaurants and cafes and saw rockets being intercepted by our anti-missile system, which is called Iron Dome, and people basically went back to their dinner and kept on going.
It's amazing, yeah.
Yesterday, a house in a community deep inside Israel, very far from Gaza, was hit by a rocket from Gaza, and the house was completely flattened, and luckily the family in the house was in a kind of safe room that we have in our houses here, and they were hurt, but no one was killed. But this is the kind of thing people have lived with here for maybe, I guess, more than 70 years, and the way the country has progressed and thrived despite those conditions is quite incredible. But it's worth pointing out that if people are imagining a place that's kind of beset by violence and kind of like a war zone, people who come here are often thrown by the fact that the country doesn't feel like that at all. In fact, in many ways, the cities here are much, much safer than American cities. I mean, if you take a city like Jerusalem, we have a population of 860,000 or so, which is the same size as Indianapolis. And if you take every violent fatality in this city last year for any reason, political violence, terrorism, domestic homicide, criminal homicide, for any reason, as far as I can tell, the number of fatalities in the city last year was 6 for any reason. And
no, that should happen in America, right?
In Indianapolis, the number was 159, and that's a pretty standard homicide number for Indianapolis. But I think we do have certain kinds of violence here, and of course it's scary sometimes, and I wish we had some way of making it go away. But in many, many ways, this country is much less violent than the United States, and I think that that's often missed by observers looking at this place from the West.
Yeah, but I do think that we should never forget what it could be around the corner, and that's different than the way that we live in America. That's for sure.
Absolutely, there's a fragility. Certainly, there's a fragility here to the place that we're very aware of, and I think often people don't understand why Israelis make the decisions that we make, or why we seem perhaps a bit kind of on edge about certain threats that seem completely crazy if you live in a place like Indianapolis or Los Angeles. But the fragility of our situation is clear to almost everyone who lives here. I mean, if you just take one example of Syria, which is a country that is about a 3-hour drive from where I'm sitting right now and talking to you, it's a neighboring country. Syria collapsed 7 years ago, and 500,000 people died, and it triggered the worst refugee problem on earth since the Second World War, and that's a country that's right next to here, and there are other examples that are right next to us. So the fragility of life in this part of the world is very real. It's not a figment of our imagination. It's something that we live with, and it's something that informs all of our political decisions.
And that's it. There's the line. What informs political decisions? And I think one of the problems that Israel has, particularly from what's going on in this country and maybe the left wing of the Democratic Party, which is so Zionism, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, it's really easy to make a judgment from over here when you're not there. You don't really get it.
That's right. From here, things look very different, and I'm not trying to justify every political decision Israel's made. I think we've made some. Yeah, I think we've made some pretty grave errors, and I happen not to be a supporter of our current government. I'm more to the left, but I certainly think that even Israelis who vote for the right here have a much firmer understanding of this place and the threats that we face than people looking at it from the West and kind of making easy moral criticisms or using this place as a symbol of things they don't like about their own societies or a way of discussing issues that they see as pressing, like racial injustice or oppression. Most of the people pontificating about this place have no idea what it is or how it works. And that is obviously something that I've written about in the past.
Yeah, and I think it's important to make the point that, don't judge. You can't judge somebody else. Don't judge America if you're not here. This is why we have countries and we run our own countries, hopefully, in democratic societies. Look, talk to me about this. Within that Israeli culture, European Jews versus Jews from Arab lands, is there, how do y'all get along? Is there respect? Talk to me about that aspect of it.
The fault line between Jews who came here from Europe and Jews who came here from the Islamic world is still maybe the most important fault line in Jewish society in Israel. So it's important to remember that 20% of our citizens are Arab Muslims. And if we're just looking at the Jewish majority, about half come from Europe, mostly Eastern Europe, and the other half comes from the Islamic world. And there's always been tension between those two halves since the early years of the state, when the new arrivals who came from Islamic countries were treated with disdain and often marginalized by the early leadership of the country, which was pretty solidly East European in origin, and they didn't know what to make of Jews who spoke Arabic and Jews who spoke Persian, and it just was so strange to them, and these people seemed kind of primitive, and they seemed to have very little to offer, and grave errors were made by the leadership in those years in the marginalization of this population, which ended up being half of the Jewish citizens of the state, and in many ways we're still dealing with the fallout from decisions made in those early years. For example, if you go to a university department in Israel, go to the sociology department, and you'll find that most of the professors are going to be European in origin. And if you go to a welfare office in a poor town in Israel, you'll find that most of the people there will be of Middle Eastern origin. So, and economic statistics bear that out. So it hasn't gone away. The gaps have narrowed. Things have changed here. In the political class, you can see it. For example, once there were hardly any Jews of Middle Eastern extraction in the upper echelons of our political system, but today the finance minister is from a Libyan family, and the justice minister is from an Iraqi family, and the culture minister is from a Moroccan family, and the head of the Labour Party, which is a left-wing party, is also from a Moroccan Jewish family. So things are changing, and the culture is changing, but we have a long way to go.
Is that partly? This is a strange question. I mean, it's hard to tell, I would assume, an Arab versus an Arab Jew from each other.
I think that many visitors here have that experience. If you stand on a street in any Israeli city and you try to figure out who's Arab and who's Jewish, you can't most of the time, and that's because half of the Jewish population is native to this part of the world, and is similar in many ways in music, for example, in cuisine, in appearance, and that's something that's very important to understand about this country. I think some Western observers, particularly Americans, who are obviously very interested in issues of race and color, which you can understand if you know anything about American society, would like to see this story as a story about race, where you have white people and dark people, but that's not the case here. The story here is much more complicated, and it has nothing to do with race in the American sense of the word.
Yeah, we could spend 10 hours on that one, that's for sure. You wrote a piece recently, oh my God, titled, New York Times, "There is no Israeli-Palestinian conflict." Huh?
I think the piece might offer a more nuanced argument than the headline would suggest, but yes, I did write a piece that encouraged people to understand the regional context in which this is happening. So I think that if you look at Israel's history, you'll see that most of Israel's wars have not been fought against Palestinians. Israel's fought wars against Egyptians and Jordanians and Lebanese and Iraqis, and Israel's most potent enemy at the moment is Iran, which isn't Palestinian. It's not even Arab. So the idea that there's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict that exists in a vacuum makes as much sense as talking about an America-Italy war in 1944. If you try to understand an America-Italy war in 1944, you won't get far, even though American soldiers were dying in Italy in 1944. But everyone understands that that's World War II, and you can't understand one component of World War II in isolation as if it's not connected to anything else going on around it. So I think that the idea that there's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that is, that there's a conflict between two actors who could work it out between them, that's fictional. That's not true. And the only way to understand this conflict is to zoom out, see the whole Middle East, and understand this as a big war that has dozens of players. And once you understand it as a regional problem, I think the behavior of the actors becomes much easier to understand. That was the thesis of that article, which I guess came out about 2 or 3 months ago in the New York Times.
And to me, one of the great pieces ever written on Israel, got to tell you. Absolutely phenomenal. Because
thank you very much.
Well, I think it was a story that hadn't been told or hadn't been written, and that, we zoom in too much these days, don't you think? We got to get that.
I do. I think people want simple stories.
Right.
They want simple stories that tell them things that make sense to them, and they want stories that deliver an emotional punch. And many stories, not just international stories, but also local stories, end up being simplified to a point where they're there's lost most of their connection to reality. And I think we all understand that our own reality is complex. So Americans understand that their own problems are complex, but then they look at other people's problems and say, that's simple. Here are two sides, one's strong and one's weak. Why don't they just sit down and sign a piece of paper? Well, things are more complicated than that.
And the Jewish mind is far more complicated than that.
Everyone's mind is more complicated.
Well, yeah, but if you sit down at a table with a bunch of Jews, you're going to go someplace you never thought you would ever get. I'm sorry, I've lived all over the world. And it is something that is very much a part of our culture. We just pick and, my God.
I think you're right about that.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I love it, and it astonishes anybody who gets in the middle of it. You also made a lot of noise. I talked about you and I talked off air. You like to make noise. You don't realize you're going to make it necessarily, but you started off as working for the AP. And this is really close to my heart because you went to town and talked about journalism and journalism's approach, some journalism organizations' approach to Israel, and I think it's very, very. It was such a great thing that you did, and a lot of nerve, I got to tell you. It remains a problem. Not just for the AP, but I see here in journalism in the United States, again, the same kind of thing. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? We don't have much time, but this is so important because the news that we read, Matti, is what most people take as absolute fact. And if it's skewered in how it's, addressed, right there we have a problem.
Right, so I wrote these two essays in 2014, right at the end of the Gaza war that summer. One was in the Atlantic and one was in Tablet magazine that tried to understand what's gone wrong with media coverage of Israel through my own experiences as an international correspondent here working for the AP. Although my critique was much broader than the AP, and I think it ends up being much broader than Israel because now I understand something that I didn't fully understand in 2014, which is that the problems that I saw in the news industry here were actually symptomatic of much broader problems in the news industry that have since become apparent. For example, like the move from journalism to more activism. Journalism has become much more active in its outlook, which means that reporters are more often choosing information that suits an agenda rather than just trying to give a solid explanation of reality upon which activists can do activism and politicians can do politics. And once activism infiltrates the press corps, no one can understand what's going on because the information has become unreliable and ideological in nature. And I saw that happening here when I was in the press corps. I saw it to my surprise. I wasn't a cynic going in. I came out quite cynical, but I was quite naive going in. And since then, we've seen major problems with press coverage, problems that have been exploited in the American political system. People now are familiar with the term fake news, and we're kind of living in a blizzard of disinformation and charges of lying, and it becomes very, very hard to understand what's going on. So I think in the old days, people would, read the New York Times or they'd see Walter Cronkite, and they would agree more or less on the facts, and then they would differ about what to do about it. But now they differ on the facts. They can't even agree what the facts are, and that's very dangerous. That's very dangerous. I'm not sure how democracies can really function under those conditions, and that's, I think, something we're going to see over the next couple of years, for better or worse.
Point well taken and terrifying at the same time. Leave us with, you wrote this book, this remarkable book. I really want everybody to read this. It really takes you into some place you had probably never been before. Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel. Leave us with the one thought you think is a powerful thought, thing that you learned in writing this book that you think you want to share with listeners.
I guess what surprised me most was how amateurish this was at the time, how little they had to work with. These were very young people, not just in the Arab section, but people in the Jewish military underground at that time. They were trying to change the world, or at least the fate of their people, and they were working with almost nothing. The odds were incredibly steep. The odds seemed stacked against them in 1948. We're kind of used to the idea that they're going to succeed and there's going to be a state of Israel, but at the time it was pretty far-fetched. Even the British thought that the Jews didn't have a chance in 1948. And I guess it shows that it is possible to shift the course of world events against great odds. And the 20th century offers not that many inspiring stories. It was kind of a grim century, I think, but but this is one. And I hope that this story brings some of that to the fore with all the complications, with sympathy for the other side, with kind of an awareness of what human suffering looks like, not just on my side, but on the other side. But I think that it's fundamentally an inspiring story about 4 very young people who accomplished something great.
And it reminds us that we never know what's coming next, but it can always have a happy ending. Thank you so much for being here. So appreciate the book. So appreciate talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.
I've been speaking with Matti Friedman. His book is Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel. For more information on Mr. Friedman and his many books, visit mattifriedman.com.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Casser-Jayne Show. The Casser-Jayne Show is a production of Resec, LLC. Be sure to tune in to the Casser-Jayne Show at HalleyCasserJayne.com or listen on your favorite app. New podcasts are posted Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern.